Hello everyone. So this is the second lecture for week 2 of distance learning. We are going to be talking about the results of World War II. And if you didn't know already, scissors beats paper. This is Churchill over here, and of course this is Hitler over here. And Churchill's going to be triumphant in the Allies over, obviously, Hitler and the Axis powers. One of the main results of World War II, and one of the most lasting results and lasting impacts that we have of World War II, is the creation of the United Nations, which still is a world organization that is in play today. And the United Nations is going to replace that ineffective League of Nations that was created after World War I. However, this United Nations is going to look after a lot more things as far as things that contribute to world peace, like economics, human rights, cultural matters, health issues, all these different things, and not just at the political measures of peace. So it really is an expanded entity, and it's going to look over a whole lot more things than just those political things that the League of Nations does. This time around, the U.S. does join, and actually the United States does host the UN in New York City. So the UN meets in New York City there and makes decisions. The UN obviously has more than just, again, that political entity. They have different organizations there within the UN. You might have heard of like UNICEF. That is the entity of the UN that looks specifically after children's rights and different things like that. So again, looking after more than just the political aspects of world peace and world cooperation, but a lot of those other issues as well. One of the first decisions and one of the major documents that comes out of the creation of the United Nations is this Declaration of Human Rights, this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is essentially a code of conduct for the fair treatment of all people. And within this, it basically says it doesn't matter where in the world you live, as a human being, you have these rights, and it is the government's job to protect those rights. So if we think all the way back to the Enlightenment, a lot of those Enlightenment ideals here being applied in this Declaration of Human Rights, but more so than that, this Declaration of Human Rights is a direct result of a lot of the atrocities that happened during World War II. Obviously, we have the Holocaust and all the horrible things that happened through that, but also the atrocities such as the treatment of refugees, the treatment of POWs, the Japanese treatment of the Chinese. A lot of horrible, horrible things happened during World War II. And this Declaration of Human Rights wants to ensure and basically say that all people should have a certain standard of living, have a certain standard of rights that need to be protected by their governments. All right, another big result here of World War II is the Yalta Conference. And the Yalta Conference actually happens before the end of World War II, as in the end of the World War II in Japan. However, it happens right at the end of World War II in Europe. So after we have VE Day or Victory in Europe Day, we're going to have the Yalta Conference shortly after 1945. And essentially what the Yalta Conference decides is that the four big Allied powers, the United States, France, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, are going to divide up Germany into different sectors there where they're going to help with occupation. Okay? Essentially what this does, though, because after World War II, we have a huge divide in the world, which we're going to talk about very extensively next unit in the Cold War. We have the divide between communist nations versus democratic nations. And what happens here in Germany is essentially we get Germany split here. We're going to have the USSR's controlled piece here, or the Soviet controlled piece, is going to become a country called East Germany, which is going to have a communist government, whereas over here, these three pieces here that are controlled by Great Britain, France, and the United States are going to become West Germany, a separate country that is a democracy. And they're going to develop very differently in the years after World War II and play a pretty big role here in the Cold War, which we're going to talk about next unit. But Yalta Conference divides Germany. So speaking of this divide here, we're essentially going to have Europe divided into two pieces here. And this divide is going to become known as the Iron Curtain. And when you think of iron, pretty impenetrable, hard to get through. There really is going to be a border between those communist nations in the east and the democratic nations in the west. So if we remember at the end of the war in Europe, the Soviets are coming from the east, coming from Russia, moving towards Germany. And as they're moving through all of Eastern Europe, they're liberating those areas from the Nazis. The Western allies of Great Britain and the United States are doing the same thing, but they're coming from the west, moving in from Italy and France. And they're also liberating those areas as they're coming through. So as a result, after the war, those areas that the Soviets liberated are going to become under the Soviet control. And the areas that the Americans liberated are going to become under American control. And later on are going to develop into those Soviet-controlled areas in the east are going to become communist, whereas those American-controlled countries in the west are going to become democracies after the war. So, big result here, we have Europe divided into communist states and democratic states. And this border, again, is going to be called the Iron Curtain. Winston Churchill is actually responsible for making that term there. He calls that kind of invisible border the Iron Curtain there. So again, just a little visual here with those red states, those red nations over here are going to be part of that Soviet bloc or the communist areas, whereas the blue states are the Western bloc or the democratic areas. And yes, the key is wrong. So this is the Iron Curtain here. Every year, kids ask me about Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, a very, very interesting state, actually. And remember, Yugoslavia is formed after World War I with all those Slavic peoples there into one mega state. After World War II, they do become communist, and they become communist under a dictator named Josip Tito, who is a communist dictator. But Josip Tito absolutely hates Stalin over here in the Soviet Union. So he doesn't want anything to do with the Soviet Union. So even though Yugoslavia is a communist state, they're not going to be considered part of that Soviet bloc or Soviet-controlled area because essentially the leaders hate each other. So kind of an interesting story. All right, we do have the formation of now two different military pacts here, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. These are military alliances formed after World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union are no longer going to be allies. That was just for the war. Now they're seen as the two superpowers in the world and are kind of forming their teams now. So these military alliances are very much based upon those political agendas. Pretty much all the democratic nations are going to join NATO, whereas all the communist nations are going to join the Warsaw Pact. Okay, so North Atlantic Treaty Organization, democratic countries in Europe, along with the United States and Canada. Warsaw Pact, those communist countries in Europe, mostly in Eastern Europe. We're talking the USSR, Poland, East Germany, so on and so forth. All right. The result here of World War II, the Nuremburg Trials. And the Nuremburg Trials are held in Nuremberg, Germany. And if we remember back to our interwar unit, Nuremberg is where those Nuremberg laws were first published when Hitler comes to power. And those are those first laws that specifically discriminated against the Jewish people within Germany. So the Allied powers thought it very fitting to try those surviving Nazi leaders in Nuremberg, kind of bringing it all to where it began. Okay. In the end, Nuremberg laws put down the precedent of crimes against humanity, which is something that you will hear over and over again nowadays, especially when we're talking about political entities and countries, crimes against humanity. And these are things that are considered so horrible that even in a time of war, they're not acceptable. So things like genocide, like we saw in the Holocaust, POW abuse, killing of civilians, non-combatants, those are things called crimes against humanity, which even in a time of war are not excusable, and thus you can be tried and found guilty of crimes against humanity. Most of the Nazis are found guilty and are executed. All right, the Marshall Plan. So Marshall was the U.S. Secretary of State after the war, so after World War II ended here. And the Marshall Plan was essentially the United States' plan to help rebuild Europe. So the United States is going to send a bunch of money to European nations to help them rebuild after World War II. Because again, most of the fighting happens in Europe. And so the United States itself, our country, doesn't see a whole lot of actual damage. Not the same in Europe. Europe is pretty devastated by the damage here. So the U.S. hoped that this would prevent these countries from turning to communism, because it was pretty evident that as countries' economies gotten worse and worse, people get more desperate, and they're going to turn towards more desperate views here and more extreme views. So Marshall and the United States really wanted to prevent those countries that are pretty economically devastated after World War II from turning to communism and thus turning towards the Soviet Union as a way to solve those economic problems. So countries that received aid also became markets for the American goods. So the United States sent a whole bunch of money over to those European nations, and now those European nations can give money back essentially to the Americans by buying American goods. However, the USSR, the Soviet Union, would not allow any country under their control. So in that Soviet bloc on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, none of those countries accepted any of these funds. So the countries that received aid became economic superpowers, whereas those other countries did not. And finally, we have the Reconstruction of Japan. So after Japan is defeated and surrenders, Douglas MacArthur, who was the general in Japan and kind of the one in charge in the Pacific Theater, he's going to be put in charge of rebuilding Japan. So he's stationed in Japan, and he's in charge of trying the military leaders like Tojo, who's put on trial and executed, removing those military leaders and putting in place a democratic government and ensuring the success of that democratic government, and also seeing the demilitarization of the Japanese army. So Japan, their military capabilities were essentially eliminated. They couldn't have any sort of offensive military. However, the United States also guaranteed Japan protection. So if anybody messed with Japan, the United States said, we'll have your back. And that was kind of the deal here. And obviously, the United States is going to help Japan financially, and this is going to help Japan become an economic power in Asia and eventually the world. And that is it. I will see you guys next week.